Welcome to Windows on the World. Tonight we're going to do a follow-up to last week's show, Ritual Sacrifice in London, which is all about the burning of heretics in the Middle Ages. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, we talked about acts that were brought in through Parliament during the time of Henry VIII, which abolished diversity of opinion. In other words, the Church was the only intermediary between you and God. And of course, Henry VIII got in the way of that and made himself the head of the Church. Very interesting times. We talked last week about this area in London, just outside the old city walls of London, known as Smithfield or Smoothfield. And this week we're going to go into one of the most bizarre stories about the burnings which took place in Smithfield of heretics. But first, let's get into a little bit background to bring you into this week's show. But I would recommend listening to last week's show, which was called London's Ritual Sacrifice, the Heretics of Smithfield. So, according to the Lateran Council, this is very important, in 1215, they stated there is one universal church of the faithful, outside of which there is absolutely no salvation. There is one God, one faith, and one spiritual authority. The lowest things reach the highest place by intermediaries, in other words, the priest class. So, they stated in 1302, this is a very important canon, papal bull, that the Vatican imposed upon the world, basically putting the world in trust to the Holy Roman Empire. It stated in Unam Sanctam, a papal bull of 1302, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff. This was Unam Sanctum, the papal bull of 1302. Now, we spoke last week about how the burning of heretics in Britain stems from an act of 1401 by the Universal Church of Rome, namely Heretico Corrumbendo, literally meaning concerning the burning of heretics. We also talked about the Act of 6 Articles, which of course made the Eucharist absolutely central to this. In other words, the communion, the blood and the flesh of Christ were represented by wine and bread. And it was called transubstantiation. There were many arguments around this, but the heretics strongly believed that the bread and wine remained bread and wine. And there is the Lutheran aspect to this as well. So if you look at the works of Luther, you will see how important this issue was and the debates that went around it. So tonight we're going to move on to one of the most strange stories, which revolved not around a Protestant heretic or martyr, but a Catholic one. But first, we just need to go into a little bit more background. So during the 16th century, those who refused to believe in certain tenets of the Roman Catholic doctrine, and even a few of those of the Catholic faith who would not recognise the king as the head of the church, and even evangelical Christians, were chained to a wooden stake and burned alive in front of huge crowds. And this place we're talking about is Smithfield, just outside London's old city walls, which has actually not changed that much. It used to be called Smoothfield, trading place for horses. There was a fair there for 700 years called Bartholomew's Fair, which was only abolished in 1855. It ran from about 1123. Founded by the monk Rahia, who also founded St. Bartholomew's Church and Hospital for the Poor. So we have this place of sacrifice which started out as a place of hope and charity. So we're going to talk tonight about someone called Friar John Forrest, who was an observant Franciscan monk based in Greenwich. Now, In 1536, the Act against Papal Authority prohibited extolling or defending the authority of the Pope by teaching, preaching, or in writing. So this is where Henry VIII had made himself head of the Church, taking over from the Pope. Very, very important that we know this, otherwise it starts to get confusing, because as we stated last week, during the time of Henry VIII, Protestants could be burned for heresy, whereas in the time of his son, the boy king, Edward VI, Protestants were actually the reformers. They were the people who were in charge of what was going on in the churches. So there's this turnaround, and then, of course, when Bloody Mary took the throne, it all went back to Catholicism. So, in other words, and to keep it kind of simple, the priests had to once again hide their wives. And this is the kind of polar absurdity of the times. So the Act of Supremacy in 1534 had made Henry VIII head of the Church of England. Parish priests were to declare a sermon 4 times a year, and the Bishop of Rome's usurped power and jurisdiction, having no establishment nor ground by the law of God. In the Lives of English Martyrs, John Forrest was stated to be 17. This is a book called The Lives of English Martyrs. John Forrest, the Franciscan monk, was stated to be 17 when he entered the monastery at Greenwich, and is also stated to have studied theology at Oxford. Now, Friar John Forrest is going to be the central character in tonight's show. Now, being an observant Franciscan, Forrest was embroiled in the argument about Henry VIII becoming head of the church. Now, another friar, William Peto, had denounced Henry's advisers as false prophets in a sermon at Greenwich in front of the king. So there was a lot of confrontation going on here. Also telling Henry to his face that he was wrong to divorce Catherine of Aragon. Well, that's fighting talk, really, because Henry had actually made himself head of the church, and we're talking about doing something rather dangerous here. I'm just seeing that we've got everything in chat now. Uniquely's contributing already, which is great. Yes, Unum Sanctum, Attorney Regis. That's right, Attorney Regis is very important. Yeah, these aren't that important tonight's show. They're sort of important to the background of tonight's show, really. But Peto and a Friar Elston were imprisoned and exiled to Antwerp for their machinations and their confrontation of Henry VIII. Now, Antwerp is a very important place as far as heresy goes, because we had a lot of the first Bibles were smuggled out of Antwerp into England, often with the help of monks. The whole thing about this is that you've got this Machiavellian kind of subterfuge going on all the way through it, which makes it all the more fascinating. Now, Thomas Cromwell, the advisor to Henry VIII, we need to talk about him because he's very important in this story. Thomas Cromwell was the advisor to Henry VIII and chiefly responsible for establishing the Reformation in England and the dissolution of the monasteries and the strengthening of the royal administration. Now, what we get is these people who kind of fawned around the king, and we get a similar character with Richard Rich, Sir Richard Rich, and these people became extremely powerful as far as dictating what was going on between the church and the state, and also indirectly the poor people who were at the brunt of all this, the heretics. Now, he ascended through the House of Commons, did Thomas Cromwell, became Master of the Jewels, Master of the Rolls, and in 1534 became Lord Privy Seal. In 1534 he was Master of Jewels, Master of the Rolls, and he became the Privy Seal in 1536, and he became Lord Cromwell of Wimbledon. He secured the Act of Restraint of Appeals to Rome. This meant you couldn't appeal to Rome, you had to go directly to the Crown, preventing appeals to Rome in marital and testamentary cases. He actually became controller of the government whilst pretending to be acting upon the king's authority. So he was really in control, this Thomas Cromwell. He also had the power to visit and reform all monastic institutions, and between 1536 and 40, all monasteries and their institutions had been taken over by the crown. In 1536, Cromwell was appointed deputy head of the church. Now, Cromwell had overstepped the mark, trying to get Henry on the side of his Lutheran beliefs and away from Henry's Catholic leanings by compelling Henry to marry Anne of Cleves. Now, he was labelled a heretic for this and a traitor. This was real subterfuge, and he's arrested. Thomas Cromwell arrested on June the 10th, 1539, and condemned without a hearing and executed on July the 28th. And this was at the Tower of London, Tower Hill, in front of a large crowd. Now, back to Friar Forrest. Cromwell had this spy in Antwerp called Stephen Vaughan, and this is what we find around these heretics. There are a lot of people betraying them, and in the case of John Forrest, this subterfuge is very important. Now, John Forrest was denounced in letters to Cromwell by these two Franciscan monks. His fellow monks denounced him. This John Lawrence was a priest, and Richard List was a lay brother. So John Lawrence and this Richard List basically betrayed Friar Forrest. They were part of his order and they betrayed him. Lawrence had been in support of Henry VIII being head of the church and was willing to speak out about what they called the king's matter. This was about the king making himself head of the church. In ecclesiastical circles, they referred to it as the king's matter. So I'm just going to make sure that everybody's in chat now. I need to refresh this, I think, because we've got quite a few people in there. Ah, yes. Great. Good evening, everybody who's in there. Yes, I've just refreshed that. So yeah, we've got letters actually. Here I've got the letters printed, and they're very interesting because you can see what was actually going on behind the scenes. So Cromwell had recruited this John Lawrence and Richard List as informers, as spies, as early as sort of 1532. Now, let's see what one of the first letters from Friar Lawrence to Cromwell said. This was written in June of 1532. So this subterfuge had been going on in the background for quite some time. He said, "I am not able to hide the ill will that our fathers have conceived against me for favouring the king's part. They invent all means possible to put me to confusion, and I cannot preach and induce the people to do reverence to their sovereign. But the friars say I preach the king's matter." So basically, this guy is being extremely two-faced here. So if we go on to Richard List again, he was a former grocer and apothecary in Cheapside, and at one time he was a servant of Cardinal Wolsey. Now, he almost immediately sets out to denounce John Forrest, who has most unfortunately for him made an enemy of this Friar Lawrence. So this is one of Richard List's letters. "Father Forrest, who neither loves nor favours you, has laboured to supplant Father Lawrence, the king's true subject, and bring him out of favour with the king and our fathers and brethren, and to expel him from the convent of Greenwich. If the king knew Lawrence's good qualities both in learning, preaching and politic wit, he would not esteem him little, and that he will well know when he hears him preach, for he has a common custom in his preachings, ever to draw the hearts of the king's subject to favour his grace. I trust that he will do the king as much honour and pleasure as Fathers Peto, Elston, Forrest and his fellows have done, to be dishonest and to bring displeasure." So there you go, he's really sticking the knife in there. As for Forrest's preachings, List's opinion was clear. This is what this Richard List said about Friar Forrest's teachings. "I think the Chancellor of London should be spoken to no more to assign Father Forrest to preach at Paul's Cross. Our fathers have often assigned me to accompany him, supposing me to possess intelligence and learning. Many a time when he has preached I have sat under the pulpit with a pair of red ears." So they've really got it in for this guy. Yeah, so Forrest, who was now a warden of the community at Greenwich, had warned the monks that Henry was suppressing the order. So this Friar Forrest seemed to be fairly loyal to the order, and he was in actual fact standing up against Henry VIII. Now Forrest claimed that he'd managed to dissuade the king from basically the suppression of the order, and in fact a commissary general was sent from France. This is interesting, isn't it? Because it's like a third party interloper who's not actually connected directly with the crown or these monks. He was sent from France, and he took charge of the Order of the Observant Franciscans in England. So he was like a third party. So John Lawrence was pulling strings behind the back of this Friar Forrest, and he wrote to Thomas Cromwell stating, "Today or tomorrow they intend to make suit to the king. It would be well if you would keep them from speaking with him." Lawrence also reported on what Friar Forrest had been saying to the monks, and that he should be reported to the new overseer, the commissary general. Well, there you go. So we've got another letter here, which is from Richard List to Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell, and he states, I'm going to paraphrase this a bit because it's a bit long. "On Monday last he was with the king, and he said that he was with his grace more than half an hour and was well received, that the king sent him a piece of beef from his own table, and that my lord of Norfolk took him in his arms and bade him welcome. I understand that he advised the king to send beyond the sea for Father Hay, who was our commissary, but this would not be to the king's honour, for he was ruled by Forrest when here last, and so did little good amongst us, neither to the king's honour nor to the profit of the religion. As far as I can perceive, he is on the queen's part. I understand that Forrest is to attend on the king on Saturday to receive writings for Hay." So basically there's all this stuff going on in the background now. So John Lawrence, the other spy, had actually managed to fall out with Cromwell as well. Now this is quite interesting. So there's all this Machiavellian stuff going on in the background here. So let's see what this letter says. Yes, this is where he falls out with his spy master Cromwell when he's writing to him. So this is Richard List. He says, "I hear you have conceived great displeasure against me, for which I am right sorry. There is, however, no just cause for it. I have always been anxious to do you service. Whatever I have been done has been for the king's honour and yours, for which I have incurred great odium. I have informed you I could never be suffered to come to you. If it be your pleasure to admit me to your presence, you will find me at all times pliant and obedient." Obedient, yeah. So it is evident from a letter of 18th of February 1533 from List to Cromwell that Father Forrest new denunciations were being made against him. It's quite important, isn't it? So List now takes a superior self-righteous tone, revealing his own delusions of grandeur as he tells Cromwell how he means to point out to Forrest the error of his ways. "I wish you to burn all my letters, for I intend to write a long epistle to Father Forrest, containing all his faults and transgressions amongst us, for which he has always avoided punishment. I shall remind him of them, that in this holy time of Lent he may be sorry for them, and make some amends to God and the religion. I shall mention his unfaithful and indiscreet conduct towards the king and you, and will show you a copy of the letter. If he take it not well, secundum evangelium, to which I think his perfection will not extend." So it's really getting quite intriguing now. So if we go to List's tone is that of every layperson who has ever written in indignation to their bishop, it says here. I'm getting some extracts here from a book called The Burning Time, written by Virginia Rounding, which came out about 18 months ago, and she's actually printed the letters. So he reported that Forrest had been unpleasant towards him personally. "Since you first rebuked him for his indiscreet words about you, of which I gave you knowledge, he will never speak to me, nor show any tokens outward that he is in charity with me. There had also recently been some scandal concerning the Greenwich Friary involving the death in prison of one brother Ravenscroft. Now, this is where it starts to get really deeply sinister, because they're now inferring that Friar Forrest has had something to do with the death of a prisoner in custody, the death of a monk who was in custody. So List it says, his arrogant dismissal of List, this is where Forrest responds, may be understandable, but was fatal for his own position. So List wrote in great indignation to Cromwell on Easter Eve on the 12th of April 1533, I have written my mind to Father Forrest because he will not speak to me, but he has not regarded my letter nor the pains I have taken after the form of the gospel, disdaining both me and my writing. Will therefore take a further process with him after the gospel. As he has been extreme in seeking great punishment for the small faults of others, I thought it necessary to write and remind him of his greater faults, and I send you a copy of the letter. You will see how he has misconducted himself against God, our religion, the king, and you. A Frenchman has just come from beyond the sea and been chosen our minister, head, and ruler in this province. I hope he will do much good and help to reform Friar Forrest and some other things amongst us. It would be well for the king and you to speak to him, that he may know how to use himself among us concerning the king's honour. Well, it starts to get very, very Machiavellian now. It's not just Machiavellian. So we go now to what happened next. In 1534, the observant friars, like all other friars, monks and canons, were required to swear acceptance of the Act of Succession and then the royal supremacy. Their refusal led to the imprisonment of many of them and the suppression of the order in England. So things are starting to get serious. And so now we look at what happened next. So Cromwell has a note among his remembrances to know, he says here, to know the king's pleasure touching Lord Mordaunt and such others as Friar Forrest, named for his principal friends, Sir John, whose strength of character is clear, it says here, furnished no evidence against his confessor, but another penitent, a man called Wayfarer, was less resilient. It was Wayfarer who related that Forrest had told him in the confessional that when he had assented to the oath demanded of him in 1534, he had done so by his outward man, but not in his inward man. Now this is something that is quite common in the Catholic Church under duress. In other words, you may actually say something that you don't agree with in order to either save yourself or for the greater good. So that was quite an interesting thing there. So basically, Friar Forrest was convicted and ordered to abjure his opinions at Paul's Cross. And this is what they used to have to do. They used to have to go out in front of a crowd and basically try and convince everybody that they meant it and they were sorry. He appeared initially to accept the judgment, but while he was incarcerated at Newgate Prison, he actually stiffened his resistance, and Latimer reported to Cromwell that some think he is rather comforted in his way than discouraged. Some think he is allowed both to hear Mass and also to receive the sacrament. If it be so, it is enough to confirm his obstinacy. Latimer also feared that people had been telling Forrest that even if he abjured as a heretic, he would be convicted as a traitor. So what was the point of abjuration? In other words, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So at Paul's Cross, on 12th of May, Forrest refused to read the recantation, laying himself open to the fate of relapsed heretics, death by burning. Yes, so this was what happened to Friar Forrest. And we'll now get into his execution and what happened just before it. Now, it was stated, this is on the 27th of May. This was Dr. Latimer at Paul's Cross. Here we go. I'm just going to cut into some of this. Friar Forrest should this day have borne a faggot at Paul's cross for his penance, and also with a loud voice have declared certain things by his own mouth after the said sermon enjoined him for his said penance, all which said things he refusing to do, the said bishop desiring all the audience then present at the said sermon to pay heartily unto God, to convent the said friar from his said obstinacy and proud mind, that he might have grace to turn to be a true penitent. Well, this didn't happen. Forrest's execution took place at Smithfield on the 22nd of May. It was in the presence of a crowd of thousands, including the Lord Chancellor Cromwell, Archbishop Cranmer, the Dukes of Norfolk, Suffolk, the Earls of Essex and Hertford, the Bishop of London, the Lord Mayor and the Sheriffs, all of course paid for by the City of London. Now, the elderly friar was dragged the short distance from Newgate Prison to Smithfield on a hurdle, dressed in his Franciscan habit, which was by now in tatters, and bound head and foot. Wriothesley described how the place of execution, where the gallows and fire were made, was railed around about, and there was a scaffold made to set the pulpit on where the preacher stood, and another against it where the friar stood all the sermon time, and a long scaffold next to Bartholomew's Hospital gate, where the lords of the Privy Council sat with the mayor and aldermen and other gentlemen and commons of the city. Now, this is where Friar Forrest met his end in 1538. Yeah, well, Latimer does not seem to have entertained a genuine hope that even at the last moment Forrest might listen to what he had to say and be converted. And, of course, this went on for 3 hours when he was trying to convince Friar Forrest to abjure, basically whilst admonishing him. And he would wish his pardon, such is my foolishness, it says here. The sermon lasted, it says here, for about an hour. In other sources it lasted a lot longer. And it was in the morning of 1538, and we've got the dates here, which I'm going to get to in a minute, because it's very, very important. We're just getting on to the next part of the story, so I'm just flicking through some stuff here, because the next part of the story is where it gets really, really weird. Forrest might listen to what he had to say and be converted. Yes, well, he didn't. So what actually happened was his habit was pulled off, a chain was tied round his waist, and he was hoisted up, suspended by the middle, pushed into a swinging position by soldiers, and he'd asked for his hands to be untied, and they were. And before being heaved into position, he's reported to have said, "Neither fire nor faggot nor scaffold shall separate me from thee, O Lord." Extra fuel for the fire was provided by the abused image of Derval Gadarn. Now this is where it gets absolutely fascinating, right? Because there's different recollections of this. You can go to Fox's Acts and Martyrs, and basically because this guy was a Franciscan monk and a Catholic, Fox doesn't give him very good write-up, saying that he was basically trying to get out of the fire, whereas he reports that a lot of the Protestants couldn't get enough of it and they were glad to be part of the whole system of being a martyr. So there's very different versions of this, but we get to the really interesting bit now, which is a journey that I made to London-Derfel, just in Merionethshire, near Monmouth, in North Wales. And the church there houses the remnants of what we're going to be talking about. Now, in the church there, Llandderfel Church, was at the time of Friar Forrest an image, a wooden image, an 8-foot image of a Welsh warrior god called Derval Gadarn, or Derval the Strong. And according to legend, he was one of King Arthur's knights. He fought at the Battle of Camlan, where Arthur's son and enemy Mordred was killed, and Arthur himself was mortally wounded. Now, after the trauma of the battle, Derval gave up his warrior life and became a wandering hermit. He found churches in North and South Wales before becoming Abbot of Bardsey, and he died there and was buried alongside around 20,000 other saints. As well as the church with his statue in Merionethshire, the little chapel of Llandderfel on the slopes of Mynydd Mine above Cwmbran in Monmouthshire was named after him. So that's the in Llandderfel, you've got St Derval's Church. As well as the church with his statue this is it, right? Pilgrims called there on the way to the shrine of the Virgin Mary at Penrith. So it was on a pilgrimage route, this is very important. And the Knights Hospitallers were also along this pilgrimage route. So this statue of this Derval Gadarn, this Welsh warrior god, was drawing quite a lot of attention. And on the 5th of May every year they had St Derval's Day, and all the locals would come and bring fruit and injured children and sick people for the actual warrior god statue to bless, because he was actually, in fact, became a priest after he was a warrior. So I'll just give you a bit more of the story of this Derval Gadarn, because it's extremely interesting, right? So yeah, pilgrimages were made along this route, so it's getting a lot of attention. Now, Derval was not the only Welsh saint to have had an earlier career. It says here, what we would nowadays call a late vocation. Several of his fellow soldiers at Cumlaen subsequently became religious leaders. So this is the thing with these Welsh warrior gods. They often became religious leaders later on. But his time as a soldier seems to have been particularly important to Derval. Most of the poetry written about him talks about his prowess as a soldier rather than his holiness. At Camlan he divided the steel in two and wore out the steel again on the mail of slaves, it says here. His statue at London-Derfel showed him not as a monk but as an armed warrior. So you've got this warrior god in 1538 in the churchyard. And the most fascinating thing about this is I'd read that there was this icon that remained. The statue was actually taken to Smithfield and burned, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the icons that remain are the stag of Derval, or Derval's horse, which was actually a red painted wooden stag, and Derval's staff. Now, when I went down to Llandderfel Church, down this tiny winding little road, and it was very hard to get to this place. It was a sheer drops on one side. In fact, it was the most dangerous road I've ever been up in that area. In the whole of Wales, it was at a sheer drop on one side. Get to this tiny little village, go up to the church, and of course, I wasn't expecting to be able to get in. I was just expecting the church was going to be locked, but I decided to go up there just to get some shots of the church. Lo and behold, door opens, I go in, there is Derval's horse, which is like this decapitated torso, the legs curled under, of this stag, which is absolutely ancient, along with this staff that could have been the staff which the warrior god Derval Gadarn was holding before the statue had been taken to Smithfield and burned, along with, yes, you guessed it, Friar Forrest. Now, this is where it starts to get very, very bizarre, because this Derval Gadarn is still represented in this church by the stag and the staff of Derval, and the whole story is in there, Llandderfel in Wales. So, the carving of Derval and his stag was of enormous importance to the people of North Wales. It was very vividly carved, and parts of it could be made to move. The eyes, for example, could blink, so a lot of work went into this thing. And it was amazing to go into this place and just be able to touch it. It was there and on show. You could just walk in, and it was a deserted church in this very, very tiny little village in North Wales. So, according to Ellis Price, he was sent by Thomas Cromwell to take the statue down. It was the time of the Reformation. Now, at the time of this, in 1538 or in the 1500s, as many as 600 people visited it on the Saint's Day in April, on April the 5th, St Derval's Day. Now, this doesn't really compare to the tens of thousands who went to Rome or Compostela on the great festival days, but it's still pretty impressive for a little hamlet in the Welsh Hills. In fact, it's more than impressive, because I doubt that there's more than Ah, right. So I think my microphone's frozen up, so I'm going to have to carry on without it. Thanks for telling me, Martin. I don't know how long I've been quiet for. I better go into chat and find out how long I've been off for. So yeah, okay. I'll just ask how long because I can get back to where we were. I'm back. Okay. Can you all hear me? Okay, right. I think we're back in chat. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yes, you can hear me. That's fantastic because I wouldn't want you to miss out on this. So Ellis Price, now remember he was sent there by Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell. He went so far as to claim that the local people believed the statue had the power to rescue them from hell. So this thing was incredibly powerful. And just to think, I've been there and touched it, the horse, or the Derval's horse, or this stag, and also this staff that was next to it in the church. Now, the other thing was that if you went to see Derval Gadarn, it might shorten your time in purgatory. So that's always a good thing if you have to rely on the Catholic Church. So it's shorten your time in purgatory. Now, Ellis's report to Cromwell is still in the National Archives in London. Ironically, he was responsible for the survival of the carving of the stag. He had been told to remove the saint's image, and he took his instructions literally. He reported back to Cromwell that he had ordered the wooden effigy of the saint to be cut away from the animal, and he set off with it for London. And if we're to rely on Price's version of events, the parson and parishioners of London-Derfel seem to have completely misread the situation and misinterpreted the government's policies. They offered Ellis Price £40 if he would let the statue remain in the parish. When he refused, they set off for London. So we have no idea how far they got, but the statue did end up in Smithfield. And this is where the whole thing is absolutely bizarre. So you've got this friar, this poor friar, being burnt to death on the 6th of April, 1538. Hang on a minute. Yes, hang on a minute. Yeah, we've already established the date. Sorry about that. I think I'm trying to catch up because of that gap we just had in the broadcast. But yes, let's carry on with this anyway. So the stag was left at London-Derfel, and it was mutilated in the 18th century by this dean, and basically it had been used as a sort of fairground ride for local children. So in the 18th century, yes, it was still being used. Now, the carving of Derval's companion is a very rare survival from our medieval past. I've just got this up to talk about it. At one time, Wales was full of these statues, so you can imagine that they had these huge warrior god statues and animals outside the churches. It must have been quite a sight. It carries on, carvings of our saints would have filled the churches and dotted the countryside. We now know about a lot of these statues because the poets wrote about them. So a lot of this stuff is hard to get hold of, but really worth trying to root out, I think, because especially Welsh history, because Welsh history, most British history in fact as well, but especially Welsh history before the 6th century and even up to the Middle Ages is, well, before the 6th century pretty impossible, up to the Middle Ages very, very hard to find. So it's a very interesting story, this, about this Friar Forrest. And what happened was they had thousands of people in Smithfield, and they're there to witness the burning of this poor Franciscan monk who's been hung in chains over this 8-foot statue of this Welsh warrior god who was brought there to prove that the warrior god did not have supernatural powers. So can you imagine how perplexed this Friar Forrest was when he was not only going to be burnt to death, but he was hoisted up above this huge statue of this warrior god who was set on fire. It's quite a remarkable story, really. And so the story about Derval Gadarn is that one day Derval Gadarn would set a forest on fire. And that's the weird story about Friar Forrest. He did set a forest on fire, but not a literal forest. Friar Forrest, the Franciscan monk. And all of this stuff is part of this unique history of Smithfield, which I think has been largely forgotten about. There's been several kind of films made about the battle for the Bible, and some of the Protestant martyrs have been featured in sort of mainstream documentaries, but there's not been an in-depth look at this, and that's what I really wanted to do, was bring you this information, because this story and the actual fact that you can go and look around for this stuff and find it, and that it's not widely reported, is exactly the sort of thing that we like to cover on Windows on the World. And the sort of story of Smithfield and Bartholomew's Hospital, which we covered last week, is a sort of makes it absolutely fascinating, the whole area. And in the forthcoming weeks I will be doing more on these. I'm just going to go into chat for a minute because we've had a bit of an interruption there when I was off air. Yes. Let's see. Oh, I see you chatting amongst yourselves. That's great. Absolutely fantastic. Yeah, so I'm making this film called The Heretics of Smithfield, which features a lot of these heretics, and the bulk of them were Protestants, but there were some Catholics and Anabaptists. We talked about that last week with Joan of Kent, the Anabaptist who was burnt. And I'm going to get now into some more stuff on Smithfield for the last part of the show. And I'd like to get into John Wycliffe and William Tyndale if we've got time, because they were the people who actually translated the Bible. Now, John Wycliffe, who died in 1384, had claimed that the Bible should be available in English, not Latin, and that the leader of the Catholic Church, the Pope, did not have more authority than the Bible, and that the Church should not sell indulgences, which are forgivenesses for sin, and that in the communion the bread and wine did not actually turn into Christ's body and blood. And what Wycliffe's followers were known as lollards, meaning to mumble. We talked about this last week, because they were called mumblers. They were often seen to be mumbling prayers under their breath. So his followers were very, very persecuted. Now, over the forthcoming weeks, I'm going to get into the battle for the Bible and what that was really about, because that in itself is fascinating. It brings in Antwerp. Antwerp is very key to this whole arena of heresy and of this subterfuge that went on, and it crossed over. You had people from the Catholic Church helping with this as well. So even when we had the Pope as the head of the church, the authority, the Church of Rome, we still had these people helping behind the scenes, because it was necessary to get the Bible out there, to get the Bible into the hands of the people. So that's what these two characters were about, John Wycliffe and also William Tyndale. And I've got a few quotes actually, because we're going to be covering these two in the next few weeks. And in court, John Wycliffe, who'd actually translated the Old Testament, he said, "You say it is heresy to speak of the Holy Scriptures in English. You call me a heretic because I have translated the Bible into the common tongue of the people. The Bible is for the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. You say that the Church of God is in danger from this book. How can that be? Is it not from the Bible only that we learn that God has set up such a society as a church on the earth?" Very clever arguments these people gave, because they didn't like middlemen. I think that's the main thing. Is it not the Bible that gives all her authority to the church? I believe that in the end truth will conquer, he said. I am ready to defend my convictions even unto death. Now, Wycliffe was a really, really interesting and important person in the battle for the Bible. We haven't got time to go into his story, but I do want to cover it in the forthcoming weeks. And of course William Tyndale as well, who lived between 1494 and 1536. So you can see that all of this stuff was going on, and these translations of the Bible and putting it into English to be read by the common people was at the heart of what was going on here. And this to-ing and fro-ing with the Catholic Church and the Protestants and the conflict of the times made it even more interesting and more turbulent. So yeah, I'll just tell you a bit about William Tyndale, actually, because Tyndale was educated at the University of Oxford and became an instructor at the University of Cambridge. And he fell in with a group of what would now be called humanist scholars meeting at the White Horse Inn in Cambridge. We talked about that last week. These pubs are at the actual centre of debate. This is why they're being closed down now. Tyndale became convinced that the Bible alone should determine the practices and doctrines of the church, and that every believer should be able to read the Bible in his own language. So, after church authorities in England prevented him from translating the Bible there, he went to Germany in 1524, receiving financial support from wealthy London merchants. Again, a lot of support for this translation of the Bible. His New Testament translation was completed in July 1525, printed in Cologne, and Catholic authorities suppressed it at Worms. They intercepted these Bibles, and the first copies reached England in 1526. Tyndale then began work on an Old Testament translation, but he was captured in Antwerp before it was completed, and he was tried in the Netherlands. And these trials were put in the hands of special commissioners of the Holy Roman Empire, and it took months and months for the law to take its course in this case. Tyndale was the most recent person, so we're going to go a bit more into Tyndale's story and cover Wycliffe at a later date and go into the whole background of it. But in May 1535, Tyndale was lured away from the safety of his quarters and into the arms of soldiers, and he was taken to the castle at Vilvoorde, the great state prison of the Low Countries, and accused of heresy, and was executed in 1536. So this battle for the Bible was absolutely key, and it's at the back of all of we're going to be talking about in the forthcoming weeks about Smithfield. So I'll just give you a few quotes of William Tyndale to finish off this show. Neither was there any heresy or diversity of opinions or disputing about the matter till the Pope had gathered a council to confirm this transubstantiation, whether it is most likely that this opinion came up by of them latter days. So basically he's saying that this transubstantiation just came out of thin air. They just decided it. This actually nothing really previously within the church that could back it up. The Eucharistic elements, he says, at their consecration become the body and blood of Christ, while keeping only the appearances of bread and wine. The bread and wine remain bread and wine, and that's key to the whole thing. So, yeah, 1536, Tyndale, condemned as a heretic, degraded from the priesthood and delivered to the secular authorities for punishment. This we talked about briefly last week, and it involved being struck with a staff and being knocked down the steps from the altar. So it's like a black magic ritual. And the last words of William Tyndale were, Tyndale said, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And that was the end of Tyndale. He was burnt as a heretic, and ironically it was 50 years after the death of John Wycliffe that he was dug up and thrown into the River Swift in Oxford. So both of these men, who were denounced as heretics, had written what became the Bible we have today, which is the King James Bible. Yes, Constantine was even born to about 300 AD. So it wasn't even born, I think that's meant to be. Yeah, Constantine had a lot to do with all this, of course, because that was his version of Christianity, and the Constantine version of Christianity is something we're also going to talk about in the forthcoming weeks, and it ties in very nicely with the hidden history of Britain, Shattered Isles, which we're going to get into again in the forthcoming weeks. So I think that's actually about it for this edition of the show. I just wanted to get onto Friar Forrest today because it was such a fascinating story, and the differing accounts of his execution state that he was either absolutely a martyr until the end, or he was just a tortured and frightened individual. He's probably a bit of both, actually, and he was very much betrayed, and betrayal and subterfuge are at the very heart of what this whole thing's about, because that's where the fear is, and that's where the fear is to this day. That's why people don't like saying things they shouldn't. It's called mind control. So that's a big part of what we talk about as well. I'm just going to tell you about a talk that I'm doing next Saturday, which is Saturday the 6th of October in Bristol. The bigger picture, you can see it on my Facebook page, and it's advertised on windowsontheworld.net. Doing quite a lot of these talks now, and there's going to be another one later in the month at Lytham St Anne's at New Horizons. That's in October, I think about the 19th of October. I think they have their talks on a Monday. We're just finalising that one at the moment. But yes, Kath's come in to chat and said timelines have been altered. Well, yes, they have. That's another key thing I wanted to get into, because when we look at history, we have to really look at what happened and deduce for ourselves what the timelines are. And when we go back into ancient history, this is particularly true. So we've got there today that Friar Forrest executed along with the Welsh warrior god Derval Gadarn. This was actually to prove to the Welsh people that their warrior god Derval was not supernatural, and he was only made of wood and could be burned. It's a bit like the Eucharist, except in reverse. In other words, they're proving that he wasn't supernatural by burning a statue of him, whereas in the Eucharist they're saying that Christ is supernatural because the body and blood of Christ are actually represented by the bread and the wine, and they become the literal body and blood of Christ. There are different arguments on this, and some of them are quite interesting. I think Luther's testimony on it is probably the nearest. What they're trying to do is get to some common ground on it without actually getting burnt to death. This is what most people were trying to do. So yeah, it's nearly a century later, when translations of the authorised or King James Version debated how to translate the original language, 8 of 10 times they agreed that William Tyndale had it best to begin with. So Tyndale's Bible was actually the defining Bible, and it became the Bible we have now, which is basically the modern version of the King James Bible. So I'm just going to check what's in chat. I've just been travelling around quite a lot over the last couple of weeks. I just got back to southeast England, and I'm feeling pretty burnt out today, actually. So I hope that's made sense. I've got a lot more to do on Smithfield, and I'm just going to check what's in chat and then probably sign off. Yeah, well, good evening, everybody, and probably good night quite soon. Yes. We've got a bit of a debate going on in chat, which is great. And yeah, next week, do come if you're around. Do turn up at Bristol for our talks. It would be great to see you. And there are many more of these things happening around the country. And we're going to get next week into geopolitics. And we've got a forthcoming series to run alongside this, which is going to be about the Shattered Isles of Great Britain. So that's about it for tonight's show. I think I've got through everything, and as I'm feeling pretty tired after all my travels, I'm going to sign off. So good night, everybody. That's it from Windows on the World for this week, and see you next week, same time, 9 o'clock.